this is why I don't use the word abduction, okay? Because I don't think where I was a craft. I think where I was in some underground facility. I remember walking towards a lighted doorway, and I got to a certain point, and somebody came up from like my left side and grabbed my arm. I didn't see who it was. At the time, I didn't even think anyone else was in the room with me. And the thing about this room, when you look at it, or what I remember from it, was that it was basically dark, but it was open at the same time. Had enough light that I could see that it was open. There was nothing really in there. And along where the ceiling met the wall, there were these long, thin, what looked like fluorescent tubes today. So it was like a single tube of space, a single tube of space. So for the longest time, this is why I don't use the word abduction, okay? Because I don't think where I was a craft. I think where I was in some underground facility. And the more I think about it, the more I believe that, because it was much bigger than what we saw. I went out this doorway. I was taken out this doorway and was taken out a hallway. It was very narrow, left and right. It's nothing fancy in this particular 69 event. And when I got to the end, I took a left. So I went out this door. I was almost pushed by my left arm out the door, down a hallway. It came to a T. Wasn't very far. That we didn't walk very far before it came to a T. Took a left, and they brought me into this room. And when I got into the room, though, the wall that I was staring at bowed inward like glass, almost like a glass rounded, like a coffee can, like a huge rounded wall of glass. And on each side of it, there was like a pocket. And I believe they were exit doors, because I actually ended up running out of the one on to the right. And that's where I saw what looked like an odd insect type of thing. I can't explain it. It had a head of looked about the size of a football. It looked like a large bug or ant or something that was engineered or what have you, but it was just, I can't explain it. No one, it's very different from what a lot of other people have seen. And I know that, but that's what we saw. It had like the legs of maybe like bamboo sticks, big fat bamboo sticks with like lime, like almost like not a purple, but like an off wine color rings on its legs. And I know how crazy that sounds, but that's what we saw. And had a
Hmm.
body of like a teardrop, and I jumped off this piece of where I was sitting, whatever it was, a table of some sort, and I ran out this right side of this glass wall. And when I got into this hallway, which is exactly what it was, it had to be, as I was young, so everything seems bigger to me. I know
Right.
that. But when I got out there, today, it would be like if you emptied out a Walmart and it was a huge round circle, and there were hallways that connected into this big round circle. And there were some markings on the floor. The hallway to my left was as wide as a 4-lane highway, and the two hallways to the right were like a 2-lane highway. So it almost looked like if you took a circle and you placed a Y over it, where the bottom part of the Y was twice as big as the top arms or pieces of that Y. And that's what it looked like. And I was taken right back into that room. I was thrown back on this table, basically, and this apparatus came over me, which almost looked like the top of a tanning bed, I guess, today, but it separated into two pieces, and it lowered from the ceiling while what I was on raised at the same time. It was very industrial where I was, too. And this piece that covered me was very simple, I guess. It almost looked like you had a cover, like let's say a tanning bed cover top, and underneath it there was a second piece that was inserted in the top lid, and it separated as it lowered, and then the bottom part was maybe a foot over me, and then the top part came and met with it, and that's last thing I really remember. Then I was back in this what I reference as a like a airplane hangar, and then back in the car. And then what was strange about being back in the car is that when my mother and grandmother were reversed, now I wasn't awake at this point. We all came out of this thing at separate times. My grandmother was now in the driver's seat when my mother was actually driving. So I say to myself, well, that seems like human error,
Hmm.
right? So this is why I'm very careful as not to overstate certain things and use verbiage that may imply that, Yeah, we were obviously removed from our car, so that was an extraction, an abduction. That was we were taken, or however you want to word it. But when you say abduction, suddenly people don't think that maybe there was some human interference or involvement in it. So I don't use that term for that reason. But when my grandmother now got, well, she was the first to awake, and no one else was responding. My mother was out like a light. My mother's in the next room, actually. She'll tell you herself. She was out like a light. My brother was in the back seat. He was out like a light. So was I. So she drives down just a little bit down this dirt road, whips the car around, and goes back into town where she just left Silk's store, where she got the cigarettes. That's where she went for help because it was a lot closer than where our house was, and there was no one at her house to help. She didn't know what was wrong with everybody. And she was still very shaken by this whole thing herself and kind of in a fog. So all she knows is everyone else in the car, you're on a dirt road, something bizarre took place, you saw something that you up front and personal, and nobody else is responding. So she went right to town for help. That's what happened. But, that always gets turned around. So she got back into town, and she went right into Silk's store. She got out of the car. When the door slammed, we believe is why I woke up, because I was the second one to come out of whatever took place. And so I followed her into Silk's store, and I remember, yelling at her, "Nana, Nana," because I was all messed up too. And it was almost like we came out of a like a surgery. And my brother mentions that a lot. It was almost like a sodium pentothal type of thing where you come out and you're still kind of foggy, but the doctor's still trying to talk to you, and you're like not really able to totally comprehend everything because you're still coming out of this thing. And that's kind of what it was like. And my grandmother was not herself. She was very, not walking aimlessly, as I've said. And when she got into the store, she got tied up between some bikes and strollers, and he came over to talk to her, and the clerk, and they knew each other very well because the store was right next to our restaurant. So he knew my grandmother something was wrong, and she tried to tell him what was going on, and I was grabbing her hand. And by the time we got outside, my brother, he was still crashed or out of it, or however you want to word it, but my mother had just come to. And so everyone came out of this thing at different times, maybe within 6 or 7 minutes of each other. But
Which
it
is
did feel,
it's a
yeah,
long period of time for that to happen.
yeah. And my brother was the youngest and the last one to come out of this thing. So if we were injected with something or given something, um, it would almost make sense why he was affected more than everyone else. I'm just saying we've thought about that. So
And they all had similar experiences when they all went through something similar?
yeah, well, like when I remember hearing my mother's voice, wherever it was we were, because I don't want to overstate anything. Um, and my mother was crying out for us. My grandmother remembers what happened. My brother, we all remember.
So you were aware of where each other was, kind of almost spatially where you were.
No, I don't know where my brother was. My brother doesn't know where I was, and I don't
But
know where but I do
but you were
remember
aware
that.
that they were there with you at
Oh, I
that
remember
time.
only my mother's voice is the only one I remember hearing.
And I don't want to fast forward the story too much and cut short details, but we are going to be bringing on the judge here. Matt's going
Yeah.
to get him on the phone for us. So if we can just fast forward just a little bit to when they, make the decision to create this UFO monument park.
Well, that's the crazy thing about it now. But I got to mention this first. So that night, people called WSBS radio. This actually went out on a AM FM radio station. And so the people at the time, Tom J, he was a ham radio operator. So people were calling him on the ham radio. We didn't know it then. So the next day we go to open up the restaurant, and we're still thinking, okay, well, we're not going to mention this again, right? People came in and were saying, we saw this thing last night. There were reports from Jug N that got a CE classification from the Air Force, and Heineck classification and all that kind of thing. And all these people were like, we saw it. Finally there was some closure in some way. And then it came over the radio again. So we had the radio going in the restaurant, and all of a sudden Tom J starts talking about all these police reports and people that had gone and actually gone into the radio station, knocked on the doors to give them their statements because they saw it so clearly and it was so close to the radio station. So at that point, that's kind of how this whole thing got inducted, because it was our restaurant was shown to have altered the natural progression of the community because of all the friction. And then this reckoning in 1969 of sorts. And that's kind of how it got voted in. So there was medical records, there were police reports, there was the radio station that broadcast it. People today that still live there remember it, and it's
Right. So
not an
it
right.
became a fabric of the town, no different than the Mothman sighting of Point Pleasant, or some of these other experiences where it became part of the town's legend and lore.
Right, but that's just it. It's not lore.